Welcome back to Chapter 2, Part 2. So we're going to start by looking at chemical reactions. Last time we covered the types of bonds that can be made. Covalent, where they share electrons. Ionic, where one atom gives another an electron, and then they're charged and attracted to each other. And then hydrogen bonds, where there are weak attractions between molecules, where the slight positive on one molecule is attracted to the slight charge on the other. So chemical reactions are the formation, rearrangement, and breakdown of bonds. So you see on one side you've got what you're putting in, and then the other what you get out. So after this reaction, what's made? So on the one side, like we'll look at on the next slide, it says these are the reactants. What goes in? Products. What comes out? What's made? So here we're making water. So like we were just talking about on the last slide, these chemical reactions can be shown by equations, like the water one there. Everything that you put in is called the reactants, what you start with. Then it goes through a reaction, and what you have that comes out, what you've made, is the products, the end materials. Here's an example of an important reaction that we're going to look at later. It's called cellular respiration. So what happens in your cells all the time is that you're making energy. We make energy in our body in the form of a molecule called ATP. You only have a few seconds worth of ATP stored, like in your muscles. But whenever you're moving, you need to pump a pump on your membrane wall. You need ATP. So your body is constantly taking glucose and oxygen, breaking the glucose down to make energy. So these are our reactants, glucose and oxygen, and these are our products, carbon dioxide, water, and energy. The whole reason we need to breathe in oxygen and get rid of carbon dioxide by breathing out is for this cellular respiration, so our cells can make energy. That's an example of a chemical reaction. Put in, lots of steps, final products. It is important to note that we can't make matter or destroy matter. Chemical reactions only rearrange it. They build bonds, they break bonds. We're not making new hydrogen ions, for example. Okay. Let's look at water and life now. Because our Earth is water-based, water is a liquid at room temperature. That's the whole foundation for life. The fact that it takes a lot of energy to heat or cool it, how molecules react with it. All of that is important for how life has evolved, how our body functions, how animals function, how plants function, how bacteria function. Without these specific properties, life as we know it would not be possible. In fact, your cells, biggest component, water. Different cells have different amounts of water. For example, muscle cells have a lot more water than fat cells. Water is the main reason Earth is habitable, that we can live here. Okay. So this is a water molecule, H2, two hydrogens, and an oxygen. We've got covalent bonds here, so the oxygen and the hydrogen are sharing electrons. The electrons are moving back and forth between the two. Okay, but they don't share the electrons equally. Oxygen, remember, it's very electronegative. It's the electron sucker. So the electrons are far more likely to be circling around the oxygen. That means the oxygen, this area, has a slightly negative charge, whereas the hydrogen has less negative charge. The electrons aren't very likely to be there, so it has a slight positive. Whenever you have different charges, you have what's called a polar molecule. That's very important. The charge there allows everything that dissolves to dissolve, and things that don't. We'll look at that more. Between water molecules, you've got this weak attraction between the slight negative on the oxygen and the slight positive on the hydrogen. So between the two molecules, this is a great example of a hydrogen bond. One bond, very weak. Multiple, very strong. Now let's look at why water is so important. What makes it great to have for life? Why it supports it. First, it's cohesive. It has those hydrogen bonds. It's attracted to each other. We use it to moderate our temperature. Ice floats. And water is a really good solvent. Let's look at what each of those means. So first, cohesion. That hydrogen bonding has the water molecules sticking together. So this tree, the leaves up there, they need water. So from the roots, water has a really far way to go before it can get there, and has to go against gravity. So what happens is you have water molecules sticking together, and as you pull the top ones up, the rest follow. It goes through these little tubes. It's cohesion. Next, surface tension. So here we've got a water strider. Uh, it's able to float on top of water because it can distribute its weight out. And you've got all these hydrogen bonds supporting it. That's what hurts when you do a belly flop. Now we said water moderates temperature. What that means is water has a strong resistance to temperature change. So if we want to change the temperature of water, we need to put in a lot of energy. So think about like when you boil water on a stove. If you just heat the metal pot, it heats up really fast. The metal has a low specific heat capacity. It's really easy to change. But when you put water into boil, you put lots and lots of heat and lots of energy, and it takes a long time to make it boil. That has a high specific heat capacity. Very hard to change the temperature. Could you imagine if we were made of metal? We would constantly be sweating and then going to like freezing within seconds because our temperature can change so quickly. Because water changes temperature slowly, it helps us maintain homeostasis, that balanced state where we can live. This is also going to be important like lakes. Lake temperature. If you jump in a lake on a hot day in April, it's going to be really cold still. It takes a long time for that water to warm up. And then heat and temperature are related but different. Heat's the amount of energy, how much the atoms are moving. Temperature measures how much heat there is. So water can absorb all that heat, like when we heat it on the stove, while only changing a few degrees in temperature. The hotter something is, the more higher the temperature, the faster the molecules are moving in there. Okay. So we can use it to monitor our temperatures. It helps us to stay alive. So like when we sweat, we have what's called evaporative cooling. As water goes into like gaseous state, it takes in heat, so it takes heat out of our body, we cool off. That's why on really humid days, it's hard to cool off because the air is so saturated with water, we're not evaporating much off. And everybody knows ice floats. If you put ice cubes in your water, they rise to the top. But why is that so important for life? What happens is when water is in an icy state, the molecules spread out, so they take up more space. So you can see here, they're more spread out in the ice. That's why ice floats. It has a lower density. That's important for like ponds and lakes and the ocean. Think about a lake in your hometown. If the top starts to freeze, the bottom's still okay. What happens is you have this cycling of water, and as it gets too cold, it goes up to the top. And then creatures on the bottom can live without freezing. There are some Arctic fish that make this kind of antifreeze where they can live in like frozen environments, but for the most part, marine life couldn't survive if the whole body of water froze solid. And then water as a solvent. So a solvent is something that dissolves other things in it. Water, lots of things dissolve in water. You put sugar in there, salt, anything with kind of a charge is going to be able to dissolve in water. That gives us a lovely solution, a mixture, where you got everything distributed through there. So like your blood plasma, that's a solution based on water. Your cell fluid, the fluid outside your cells, it's all based on water's properties. So water is the solvent. That's what's the thing in the largest proportion. It's what everything is dissolved in. The things that are dissolved are called the solutes. So here in salt water, salt would be the solute, water would be the solvent, and salt water would be the solution. And this shows you how when salt gets in there, the partial charges on the water surround the chlorine and sodium and help break it apart, dissolve it. And then anytime you have water as a solvent, the result is what's called an aqueous solution. Aqua, water. It's water-based. Next, we're going to talk about pH. And this topic can be pretty confusing to people, but it all has to do with the amount of hydrogen ions in your solution, like in your aqueous substance, like in your blood. Acids, they put more H plus in the solution. So when they get in there, a hydrogen ion dissolves off, goes into your water. Bases do the opposite. When they get in there, they take hydrogen ions from the water. They take them out of solution. And let's look at the pH scale. So it goes from 0 to 14. 7 is neutral. That's water. And as you go higher, you get more basic. And as you go lower, you get more acidic. So like gastric, stomach acid, very acidic, about an acidity of 2. So if you look in there, in that solution, there's lots of H+, very acidic. And the neutral, H plus equals OH minus, you got H2O. That's water. And in the basic, you've got lots of OH minus, very little H plus. And the pH scale is what's called an inverse logarithm. So the more hydrogen ions, the lower the pH. So that's what inverse means. As pH goes up, number of hydrogen ions go down. And then logarithmic means if you change your pH by 1, you go from 7 to 6. You've gotten 10 times more hydrogen ions. So if you go from 7 to 5, it's 10 times and 10 times, so it's 100 times more acidic. So a little change in pH is a large change in hydrogen ions. They found this would be the best way for us to understand and show the differences between solutions. So here's a nice example showing hydrochloric acid, HCl. When that goes into water, those two parts dissociate, they dissolve, they come apart. So now you've added H plus to the water. That's an acid. NaOH, sodium hydroxide, that's a very strong base. When that goes into water, that dissolves. And instead of adding H plus, it gives you more OH minus. And then salts are things that dissolve but don't change the pH, like sodium chloride. Okay, now let's look at buffers. So buffers are things that resist pH change. So what happens if you add acid? They take up the hydrogen ions you've added. If you put in base, they give up hydrogen ions. They're usually weak acids or bases that are kind of willing to either have the hydrogen ion or not, depending on what's in there. It's so important for our body to have pH buffers. Otherwise, if our pH could change really quickly, if we drank a big glass of orange juice, that could alter our ability of our red blood cells to carry oxygen, for example. That's the end of chapter 2. Best of luck. You're now ready to take a quiz on chapter 1 and 2.